We're going to be looking here at infrastructure and the problems of infrastructure when it comes to economic development. So, firstly, if you define infrastructure correctly, then the analysis later on becomes much easier because you can link it to economic growth and to economic development in particular. So, infrastructure is any sort of physical capital. It can be the communications and transportation, roads, railways, airports, um, anything like that. Ports as well is important. It can be the public services, it can be hospitals and education and the schools, and it can be the provision of utilities. And so you can see that these particularly are linked to the HDI index, health and education, and you can see that these are also important when it comes to measuring economic development and some of those, the SDGs that the United Nations have come up with in terms of the provision of water, sanitation, etc., the Sustainable Development Goals. So try to remember that. The World Economic Forum, they define the infrastructure by looking at the connectivity index, the quality of roads and railways, airports and trains, and shipping efficiency, electrification, power transmission, distribution losses, power outages as we're going to call them, and then exposure to unsafe water and water supply. So much greater idea of what we mean by infrastructure by looking at that World Economic Forum definition. Okay, so start with that, and these are the three key ones I think that you need to be aware of. Okay, so what are the reasons for the problems in infrastructure? Well, the upfront costs are very large. Big infrastructure projects cost a lot of money. And the governments in these developing countries, like any other government, could raise taxes, but that is obviously going to have an effect on economic growth. Okay, or they could cut other spending because there's an opportunity cost. And again, that could have an effect on economic development because if they cut spending on other things, let's say they want to put in a good structure of roads, for example, but they have to cut health and education, then that directly affects the HDI. So they tend not to do these things, but they tend to borrow on international markets. Now, there's different ways of borrowing, don't go into the details here, but that leads to what we call sovereign debt, and countries will borrow from other countries, from the World Bank, from pension funds, from sovereign wealth funds. But the key is they borrow in dollars. Okay, that's really important for some of the issues later on. Sometimes they can get inward investment, foreign direct investment, and they can do that by way of joint ventures sometimes. So they ask other companies to come in from other countries. So China's been a great one for helping Africa to develop by bringing in a lot of infrastructure. But as you'll see in other work, often when they do that, then there's a problem in repaying it. And sometimes, like in Pakistan at the moment, there's a lot of debt in Pakistan, and the Chinese are being asked to keep funding their power systems, basically their power generation systems, and the Chinese are a little bit reticent about doing that at the moment, and they're having to call the IMF in because they literally have, I think it was 3 weeks left of reserves to pay for imports in Pakistan at the moment. This is February 2023, so keep an eye on that story. So infrastructure spending is long term and it needs stability, and that's one of the reasons why the Chinese are saying they may not lend to Pakistan, is because of the instability that there's been in that country, and the fact that in the past when they've lent them a lot of money, they haven't been able to repay them and they're defaulting on the debts. The exchange rate is also key. If it's expected to fall, the investment in that country is going to be a lower value. So, as I say, there is this current example going on here. I'll just give you two ideas. This is from the Financial Times. The figures are start. This is Pakistan. Their foreign exchange reserves only $3 billion. That's just 3 weeks of imports. they have nearly 270, 300 billion pounds worth of public debt. That's 80% nearly of their GDP, and the country is facing blackouts. But then the article goes on in the Financial Times. It's not just up to the IMF to provide this extra money, because their biggest bilateral creditor is China. China holds 30 billion pounds of debt, and that doesn't include the billion to Chinese power producers. And there is a suggestion that by lending this money, which they did over many years to help with their Belt and Road Initiative, then they've created a debt trap for emerging markets. So those are the reasons why countries have problems. What's the implications? So the implications for three different sectors. Very straightforward. There's an essay here. What about the firms and the industry in these countries that have got this poor infrastructure? Well, you're going to have longer transport times receiving raw materials if you haven't got roads and railways, etc. Getting goods to the market, it's going to take longer. It's going to reduce your productivity. It's going to mean your prices are higher, reducing competitiveness, and obviously for the consumers reducing their real incomes if they got higher prices. So some real problems here. Geographical immobility of labour are going to be much worse if you haven't got transport to get workers to where the jobs are, and there's going to be less choice, you see, for firms as well, if they can only choose people who can walk to their workplace. And so that's going to mean that wages are going to be higher. A lack of the internet, that's part of infrastructure. Remember, you're unable to find your cheaper raw materials. Often on the internet is where you can find cheaper raw materials and buy them in, and they can't sell into other markets, particularly foreign markets, if the internet is quite poor in that country. So they're not able to find good markets for their goods. And big one, mentioned India, mentioned Pakistan. Poor power supply leads to power outages all the time, and so firms often set up for business, then they find that the power goes down and they're wasting hours and hours before the power comes up and they start to produce again. So real problems in terms of efficiency, higher costs, etc. For firms in those countries. Second one I think I would be looking at is trade, and you've got to go back to the benefits of trade, but you need internal transport to get to the ports or the airports, but then you need a good an efficient and large enough port or airport, and if you haven't got that, then trading is going to be difficult, so you're not going to enjoy the benefits of trade. Comparative advantage, larger markets, hence larger firms, economies of scale, lower costs, and the competition that trade brings, which forces efficiency into firms. So without these ports and airports, trade is going to be much more difficult for firms, and also foreign direct investment is often attracted into countries because they want to invest within a country in order to sell their goods to other countries around the area, to the countries that border one country. And if there's no ports and airports, etc., and if there's poor infrastructure in terms of railways to get their goods across land to someone else, then obviously FDI is not going to be attracted to those countries. So second big point would be trade. Third big point, direct effect on development, that there's going to be poor power supply, as we mentioned, sanitation, running water, drainage. It has a very direct effect, and you can mention there the Sustainable Development Goals. Some data, loads of data out there, 26% still don't have a safely managed drinking water, 46% don't have safely managed sanitation, and nearly 2 billion people are lacking basic hand hygiene. So really important problems in terms of economic development and living standards, and it was particularly these sorts of things that caused huge problems when we had the COVID infections going around the world, that some countries were badly affected because of the lack of hygiene facilities that they've got. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what are the implications for development of a lack of infrastructure. But as I say, make sure you get a good definition of infrastructure so that you can hit those three big points: the impact on directly on HDI, the impact on trade, and then the impact on the firms as well. Okay, hopefully that's helpful.